actually just got back from an all-team retreat at the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama, which Brian Stevenson, I don't know if you're all familiar with his work, that's focused on looking at the legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, and mass incarceration, the connection, the lots of inequalities that exist across many systems and inequities that exist across systems in our country. And so I'm feeling real emotional right now, and so just wanted to make sure we're clear on what we're talking about here. And I think the thing that really resonates with me after having that experience, and I encourage all of you to go to Montgomery and have this experience, is inequities are throughout our work, throughout our systems, and whatever space that you're in, it's important that you work on improving it. And so today we're talking specifically about education, and then even a subset within how Edtech can support this. And if you were in the talk with Kaya before this session, you know, she mentioned that, you know, Edtech is a tool, it's a supplement. You know, it's not the thing that's gonna solve it, right? We know that. And so as you're thinking about, you know, as we're having this discussion about Edtech, no one up here is saying like Edtech is the solution. Like, we're thinking about it is part of it. And we actually at NewSchools, let me just introduce myself for a second. I'm Tonika Clayton, and I'm a managing partner at NewSchools Venture Fund. And we recently partnered with Gallup to get information directly from students, teachers, principals, and educators about their use and perceptions of Edtech. And something that we learned is that 65% of teachers use it daily to teach. And over 90% of students are using it a few times a week for student learning. And so we know that it is an integral piece of the teaching and learning experience in K-12 classrooms in the United States. And so as someone that has 3 Black children that are out there that grew up, you know, kind of seeing what things can look like in a system that is, you know, either biased towards one group or another, I'm very conscious of, like, what are my kids experiencing when they interact with Edtech? Are the tools that are out there, is there bias in these tools? Are they meeting their needs? And how is it meeting the needs of different segments, especially students from underserved backgrounds? And so just wanted to set that context before we get started with my great panelists here. We have a professor, we've got 2 district leaders, and I'll let them introduce themselves. But before we get started, I did just want to share some additional data that we got from the field when we asked questions about perceptions and use of Edtech, when we looked at high poverty, when we sliced the data by students and teachers from high poverty schools and students and teachers from low poverty schools. So one thing, and this is from a survey of over 3,000 teachers and over 2,500 students, and again, looking at the differences between high poverty and low poverty, the usage was about the same across. So no market difference there in terms of like the usage, and we talked about the daily usage, and over 90% use it to learn during the week. The demand differences were different. So both students and teachers from high poverty schools said that they wanted to use Edtech more, whereas students and teachers from low poverty schools were less likely to say that they wanted to use it more. There were some access differences. Students from high poverty schools are more likely to have one-on-one devices that they can actually take home. Students from low poverty schools are more likely to have one-on-one. Students from high poverty schools are more likely to say that they had to share devices, and also that the devices that they use were older, or had or just weren't as new. Another thing is that teachers, we don't want somebody calling me. Another thing was teachers in high poverty schools were more likely to cite lack of devices as a barrier to success of implementation. There was also differences in use of how teachers from high poverty schools use EdTech. So students and teachers were less likely to use EdTech for collaboration, creativity, and research, or collaboration, creation, and research in high poverty schools when compared to students and teachers in low poverty schools. And so while we have a lot of questions about that, I want to caution and not jump to conclusions about why that is, and we're actually doing some additional analysis investigation, but I did want to set this just as some context before we jump into a conversation about what it means to use EdTech and whether or not we can use EdTech to close equity gaps. So with that, I am going to pass it over to our panelists to introduce yourself and to share how your work intersects with EdTech, access, and equity. And we'll start with Erin as a mic.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for choosing our session. It's going to be the best one. My name is Erin McMahon. I'm the Chief Academic Officer at the Kipp Foundation. Kipp is a national network of charter schools. We have 228 schools in 20 states and the District of Columbia. We have both urban schools and very rural schools. So we have a really beautiful canvas from which to understand how education technology is working for all children, regardless of their race, gender, income level, and other lines of difference. And so when we think about the work of EdTech in our schools, we think, what will work at scale? Because one of the things that we want to make sure that we do is that we stay consistent across our schools so that we provide consistently excellent education. And one example of that is our work as we've rolled out Amplify, which is a K-4 science curriculum. It's also goes into the later grades, but we've found that what that has allowed us to do at scale is to have consistently high quality content and consistently strong access to high quality experiences for kids in the realm of science. And I work very closely with Kipp New York, and we saw just in their first year of adoption of a curriculum that was high quality and leveraged education technology, we saw a 4% jump in a single year. In a year, that's a single, but if you think about the data point over time. So my take for the panel today is thinking at scale, how does education technology impact across our states?
Good morning. Sorry. My name is Paul Foster. I am the Chief Information and Accountability Officer in the Springfield Public Schools. I'll say Springfield, Massachusetts, in case anybody's wondering, since I think there are 50 Springfields. And so just a little background on our district for those who don't know. We have about 25,000 students, PK to 12 in 58 schools. We're 80% of our students are economically disadvantaged, so that's part of our context. And so obviously the equity conversation, I should say also 85% of our students are students of color. And so the equity conversation is obviously critical to our work and the work we're doing. And my role in the district is really around, I lead all of our technology work as well as our data assessment research work, and increasingly because of the intersections between the stuff we're talking about today with technology and also teaching and learning, I increasingly have a role in leading our digital learning and student-centered or personalized learning work in the district. And so as it relates to this conversation today, I think I feel like I live some of the data from the Gallup poll on a regular basis. I will say in Springfield, one of the things we tackled, which was the easy part, was access. So as a district, we do have one laptop that we provide to every student in grades 3 to 12 across all of our schools. We also provide laptops at a ratio of 1 for every 2 students in K1 and 2. Some of that was based on feedback from our educators that there's a lot of stuff going on in K1 and 2 that maybe shouldn't be on a computer, and we didn't need to be one-to-one at that level. And we do send, we let our schools have some autonomy about deciding the when of sending laptops home. At this point, about half our schools send those laptops home with their students. So that was the access piece, right? But then the other piece of the data that I heard, and that was in higher poverty schools, seeing the Edtech being used less for creativity, less for collaboration, less for, I guess you'd say, higher order or problem-based learning. And I think that's definitely an experience we have in Springfield and something we're really working through and trying to get better at. Because I think if you think about Edtech, there's Edtech that is, I will refer to it as digital drill and kill. I'm sure no one in this room is doing that. And then there is Edtech that really is empowering students to be creators and to be collaborators and authentic problem solvers. And I think it's an interesting conversation about, in the Edtech space, what is being sold to and bought by urban high poverty districts compared to what's being sold to and purchased by what I guess lower poverty districts, and thinking about that challenge, because this would be a whole other panel, but you could have a really interesting conversation about innovation in an era of high stakes 12-month cycle accountability, and how that impacts decision making around how do we use technology, right? Because if there's educators who are worrying on a daily basis about, will I be employed next year if this math and English score don't go up, how does that impact decision making about what's going to be purchased and what's going to be implemented in the classroom? So that's kind of, I just think hearing that Gallup data and thinking about this question, something we're wrestling with in Springfield is not just using our one-to-one technology to do interventions, but how can that one-to-one technology really transform core instruction so that we're doing real, true sort of problem-based, project-based learning where kids are really owning what's happening in the classroom.
So my name is Kevin Clark. I am a professor of instructional technology or learning technologies at George Mason University. Have been there for 20 years. Prior to teaching at George Mason, I actually was part of an Edtech startup. And so I helped design and develop some of the first educational games that were developed and sold on the Sony PlayStation. And we did think it was going to save everything. It was going to totally... I traveled the country and went to school districts saying, this is the best thing since sliced bread. And so that experience of designing and developing educational software for 5 years informs now the work that I do as a researcher. And so some of the work that I've done has been to look at how we use opportunities, such as for my expertise, game design. How do we use game design to get young people and girls, kids of color and girls interested in STEM? And so for 7 years, I ran a game design program in Washington, D.C., and we saw how you get young people engaged and motivated to do well in STEM. And then after that, I began to look at other ways of using technology and media creation to inform how that impacted children of color. And so it led me to look at the media in general, children's television, children's content, because when you understand that Black and Latino kids are exposed to and consume 13 hours of media per day, as compared to 8.5 hours of media for their white counterparts, you understand that that media should reflect who they are and who you want them to be, but it doesn't. And so because of my experience as a developer, I know what goes into making these products, and nothing is by accident, nothing is by happenstance. And so in an effort to address issues of equity, representation, I have looked at my research and tried to craft it in a way that goes from technology to opportunities and then to media, so that we make sure that young people see themselves, see their communities, and see their possibilities in the content and media and technology that they consume. So that's kind of how I approach the issues of equity in EdTech.
Okay, so we're going to have an opportunity to do a quick Q&A at the end. So be thinking about if you have any questions. I'm going to ask some questions now, but you'll have an opportunity to engage as well. So Erin, I'll start with you. You talked about an experience you've had implementing EdTech that was successful. Can you share some of the challenges and some of the bright spots you've experienced through this journey?
Thank you. What we've noticed across all implementations, whether of curriculum, whether it's EdTech or not related to technology, is that there was 3 factors that were incredibly important. The first was professional development, teaching teachers how to change their practice. Because what we found, and one of my friends and colleagues, Eileen Murphy, who runs Think Circa, talks about it. She says there's a tension between what sells quickly with what is efficacious. What is efficacious requires a change in teacher practice. And so the most successful implementation of any curriculum, whether it's online or not, supported by EdTech, has been effective professional development to support teachers as they learn, which then supports kids as they learn. So our teachers are first as the frontier for anything related to education technology. The second is the assessment of student work. What we find can often be very, very weak, as Dr. Clark talked about, is when media is just media and it becomes digital babysitting without giving you any information about how a student is doing, it really becomes just a waste of time. And given that time is really the finite resource we have in schools, we have to think about what is this student using and in what way, so that it tells us about what they know and what they do not yet know. So the second is their assessment. And then the third piece related to EdTech that is incredibly important is the quality of the content and the infrastructure with which it is delivered. So we think about, is all content at a grade level standard or above? Does it allow for flexing based on the student who is using it? And then does it allow the teacher to be able to use it easily? So again, when we think about our traditional delivery structures, it's usually student, teacher with device. And we want to make sure that that infrastructure is seamless and that it doesn't present a barrier for our teachers. So given that, I work with a student who, I'm a professor teaching education leadership at Columbia Business School, and several of my students are very interested in education technology. And the work that we've done over the last semester is really looking to say, what investments show you that they have effective professional development, they assess student work in a way that is usable by the teacher and the student, and there's an infrastructure that maintains quality and ease of use.
Thank you for that. Paul, you started to share some of the observations that you've had in your district about the use of EdTech, despite the fact that all of your students have equal access. Can you share more about just what you've experienced and what the outcomes have been?
I'll start with a story. I mentioned that we've been working towards personalized learning as a district, and speaks to what Erin's talking about changing teacher practice, right? So moving to a mode where students really have much more ownership of what's happening in the classroom and their learning experience. So as part of that initiative, we always did learning walks. We'll walk into classrooms, and we had a new intervention that had been purchased, it's actually a decent intervention. It's about supporting students who are below grade level in both math and ELA, and that had been implemented district-wide. And I can recall going on an observation and walking into a classroom, and the principal was very excited to show me that they were doing personalized learning. And what the kids were doing is, and this is it's a fine intervention, but kids were doing their 15 or 20 minutes a day on the laptop, going through a series of problems. But that is not. It's well designed. It's adaptive. All of those things. But that's not what we mean by personalized learning. It's not what we mean by problem-based or project-based learning. And so I think, and I worry about in Springfield, and I think this is a worry in other places as well, we need to get past just that use of Edtech and get to things that really amplify the role of the teacher, like help the teachers, both help the teacher make that transition in their practice, but also are just supportive as opposed to, you're going to do 20 minutes on this product. Now you're going to do 20 minutes on this other product, and then you're going to do 20 minutes. I mean, one of our goals in Springfield is really to think about how do we make school fun. I mean, I love the stuff that Kai Henderson was talking about this morning, right? I mean, my 3 children have two of them are still in the Springfield public schools, but I've sent my kids to the Springfield schools, and I don't like it when my own children come home and say they hate school. And, especially when I work for the district that they go to. And so I just think, thinking about how Edtech can actually make school a better experience for children, a better learning experience, and where it relates to equity for the kids in my district. How are we using Edtech in ways that empower them in their learning? Because they're not empowered in a lot of aspects of their life in Springfield. And so how are we giving them opportunities to create? I mean, one of the things we've said, this is sort of a colloquial version of a mission statement for our personalized learning initiative, is how do we get to the place where every kid goes home from school at least some days of the week saying, you won't believe what I did today. And I think Edtech can help us get there. But I think there's also lots of things out there, like I said before, that are actually just a digital version of what we've always done, and thinking about the difference and thinking about how do we make sure we're making the right investments. And so I think that's a critical piece, and I think of that as much of Edtech that we've adopted so far has been in the intervention space. And we've seen some results, right? We've seen that move some scores for students. But we need to also think about how can Edtech transform core instruction, right? Because in a district like Springfield, we actually, we get our student growth percentiles, which is the value add measure in Massachusetts. One of the things we know is that actually our students who are lower performing have higher growth scores than our students who are higher performing, which says something about what's happening in our core, right? It says something about the level of rigor in our core. And so we can't just move kids up who are behind. We also have to move all kids forward, beyond a grade level standard. I don't know if I answered the question, but...
All right, so Kevin, you talked about studying the Black student experience, and what findings did you uncover that could help us make sense of how to best use Edtech to promote equitable outcomes with Black students?
So I worked with a colleague at Arizona State, and we did a national study on how African-American tweens and their parents use technology for learning in their homes. It was called The Digital Lives of African-American Tweens. And it was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And it was the first of its study where it just focused on African-American families, because there had been some other studies that talked about usage, but the sample size for African Americans was always really, really small. And so we had a sample size of almost 1,500 dyads, meaning a tween and a parent. And what we found, there were a couple of findings that were, for us, that kind of stood out. One was that depending on income, it actually impacted a child's ability to have access to computer and technology expertise. So what that means is, if you're in a district and they're doing a one-to-one initiative, it's great when that child is in school. When that child goes home, if they're in a low-income household, they cannot get access to someone who can help them fix the computer or answer questions about software. And so even though one-to-one initiatives are great, the reality is that you need to also figure out what happens when a child goes home, because children reside in 3 areas, right? Home, school, and community. And so when we create EdTech solutions, we should think about those 3 areas. The other finding was the amount of negative and disrespectful content that African American children were coming in contact with. Our research found that a third of the youth, a third of the time, they were coming into contact with negative content that was related to race, and a fourth of the time they were coming into negative content that was related to gender. When I opened, I talked about the 13 hours of media exposure. And so when I saw this finding, when I saw it in the research, I went home and unplugged everything. My kids were like, you know, right now I have a 20-year-old and a 17-year-old, but they were, you know, I was done. Because I'm thinking, first of all, Black and Latino kids are consuming the most media, and much of that, a third of it, is negative regarding race, and a fourth of it is negative regarding gender. And so that was not a happy day in my household. And the third finding that I will mention before I toss it back, and that is the relationship between how young people see technology in their lives is directly correlated to how their parents see and use it. So if their parents think it's a good thing, if their parents are using it, then the chances are that the kids will use it too. And so, again, when we create these EdTech initiatives, we can't just focus on kids individually. We have to look at their families, we have to look at their schools, and we have to look at their communities.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask one question that all of you all can answer, no particular order here. But what are the conditions that are needed for EdTech to positively impact student outcomes?
So I'll go first because I think I can be relatively quick because I feel like I've talked to it a little bit already. I kind of jumped the gun, but I think for me there's 4 things I would highlight that are critical. So, and a couple of them I've talked about already, so I'll breeze past. One is it has to support and enhance the role of the teacher and not replace the teacher. I feel like it's tempting, right? When you're in a district like I am that's underperforming, it is tempting to try to just throw everything out there and hope that one of the things you throw out there works. But we need to, you heard it this morning in the keynote about human capital. We need to build our teachers, and we need to provide tools that make it easier for our teachers to transition to different modes and different pedagogies. So that'd be one, is supporting and enhancing teaching, not replacing teaching. I think, like I talked about already, supporting the transformation of core instruction. So not EdTech as intervention, EdTech as, again, a resource that supports tools to transform what they're doing in core instruction, so the teaching and learning practices. Related, I think paying attention, this is something I've started doing much more when I'm looking at new products, is paying attention to the student task. What is the EdTech tool actually asking the student to do, right? Is it actually asking them to do higher order thinking and problem solving, or is it asking them to do rote memorization, or just, like I said earlier, digital worksheets? So paying it, just like we do when we go in and do classroom observations and learning walks, you pay attention to what is the teacher doing, what is the student doing. When we're evaluating EdTech, what is the student doing on the product? How are they using the tool? The last thing I would say is, and again, Kaya Henderson talked about this really well this morning, but using your own data to evaluate, right? I've never met a vendor who didn't have awesome data, saying how great their product was. And so, we've had a chance to partner with Maple, which is affiliated with LearnLaunch, to use the Learn platform to do some early evaluation of what's happening with some of the products in use. And I think we're early in that process, so I don't have a lot to say about how it's working, but just that notion of, like, we have to look at, okay, use of the tool and then relationship to how our students' outcomes based on our data, not based on the data that comes out of the product. So I think those are the 4 that I would say.
So I'll build from where Paul left off. When I think about just purchases, like who has the purchasing power, who has the budget, who's making the decisions on education technology, they are ultimately deciding what the students have access to if it's in school. And so when I think about entrepreneurs and those who are developing EdTech solutions, they need to focus on helping leaders, school district leaders, school principals, teachers, teacher leaders, solve their problems within the education system versus entrepreneurs solving their own problems that they had with school. So looking into really what is it that systems are wrestling with, what are schools and systems of schools wrestling with, and then that then allows us to then come in with a common problem that we're trying to solve, and then think about if the tool is not scaling, or it's not working effectively across classrooms or across schools, that's often because the solution isn't solving for the problem that the school and district leaders have. And so when I think about that, what's most important to me for students to have access to high quality curriculum with EdTech as an option, it is start with the student in mind. What is the problem that we're solving for? Work backwards to what the role is of the teacher and the school leader and the school district leader in also solving for that, and then work together on a plan that really brings coherence to an overall instructional plan for all kids. Because as Paul said, when you have just a series of interventions, a series of tools that we sort of throw at kids because teachers might get them, in a freemium model, and when they just get them for free, and then organizations will come to us and say, hey, 40 of your teachers are on this. Well, and that's great, but that doesn't actually tell me that we have a coherent instructional model that's working for the best interest of all kids in every classroom. Number one, number two, and number three, start with what is the problem we're trying to solve for kids, what assets do they already have, and let's work backwards from there.
So I think we need to think about the ecosystem in which the EdTech solution will reside. And so I talked about home, school, and community. And within those three places, we need to think about how educational technology can be used to create a learning ecosystem. And you need four things, in my opinion. One, you need access, so access to technology, access to broadband access. And that access needs to be consistent. So, you can't lose it at a certain time. You can't only have it at school and not at home. So you need consistent access. Then you need expertise. You need your own expertise, and you need expertise around you, right? The third thing you need is mentoring. So I mentioned a game design program, and in that game design program, I actually had students serve as instructors and mentors to other students, because the majority of the number of teachers who could teach a game design course at this particular high school, it was like 2 or 3 people. And so, but this notion of mentoring and helping students understand how they can help each other was also hugely powerful in implementing this EdTech initiative. And then the fourth and last component of this learning ecosystem is application, meaning you have to provide some way of applying the technology in a way that's relevant to the student and their community. Don't just teach them a skill in isolation that will never be used or that can never be used to deal with everyday problems or everyday issues. So teach skills and apply them in a way that's relevant to the student and relevant to the community. So access, expertise, mentoring, and application.
Great, thank you. What's super funny to me about what you just said about the students teaching the other students, one of the things that we found in the Gallup survey, we asked a question about students, whether or not they need support in using EdTech tools, and like very few said yes. Whereas you ask teachers something and they say, yeah, we need more professional development to support the youth. Students are like, no, we got this. So empower them to actually use and teach others on the tools. So I'm going to open it up for questions since we have about 10 minutes left to see if there are any questions out there. We have a mic runner. I see a young lady right here. She's raising her hand. If you look straight ahead.
Hi, thank you everybody for a great panel. I have a question for Kevin Clark. Was wondering if you could you talked a little bit about what EdTech looks like in the community context, and was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about like what is your definition of community, and also if you could maybe shed some light on some specific examples of really wonderful examples of successful use within community. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks. So community is essentially where you are. It could be your neighborhood, it could be your county, your city. And so, and I use it loosely because people define it broadly. It could be, so it's broad. In terms of specific programs, as I mentioned, the game design program. So we did a game design program and it was community-wide in this particular neighborhood in DC. And one of the things that we did was we focused on how to use that technology to impact the things that students were doing in their community. So they would build 3D models of places in the city, and they would put those things into their games so that then when they brought their parents in to show them the games that they created, they would include familiar places. And so the piece of that allowed that initiative to become community is because then we trained and educated parents on the video game industry. Because initially parents came to our program just wanting to give their kids something to do, not realizing that being a video game designer is actually a viable career. And so we would have sessions with parents on this is how much a game designer makes. These are the programs in the country that offer degrees in game design. And so it wasn't just teach the kid how to design games. It was also educate the parents on how to support them in this particular effort.
Other questions? You can choose. I'll let you choose since you have the mic.
Thanks. A couple of you mentioned that the teacher should be the initial focus, and that makes a lot of sense because they're the ones that are going to have the impact on their scholars every day. So just curious if any of you are, what you're doing for that professional learning that may be different than the traditional model, or if it's just not different and it's going well.
So I'm not trying to put sure.
What's different in professional learning?
Not enough is different in professional learning. Is that an answer? I think, you know, when I talked about our personalized learning work, I mean, we're trying to do personalized PD in the same way. We're trying to model the kind of classrooms we want for students with teachers. When we do our PD, I think, again, I mean, not enough as we ought to be doing. I think in the EdTech space where you're talking about starting with teachers, I think, you know, there is that element of listening to teachers, what they need, what they want, what they like, what they don't like. I think we could do a better job at that as well. But, you know, Erin mentioned the freemium model, and I think it's as a person who oversees IT for a district, I find the freemium model super aggravating because teachers will come and say, hey, I tried this thing, it's really great. You know, can we now roll it out to 25,000 kids? However, there is an element of the freemium model which is an opportunity to listen to teachers, right? It's an opportunity to, if teachers are on their own picking something up, that probably says something about how they feel about that tool. I don't know if I answered your question, but that's...
Erin, did you want to?
Just a short vignette on that. When I worked with Denver Public Schools, we were considering within education technology, we were looking to support our high school students as they prepared for the SAT, and a positive result of teachers they were using the preparation through the Khan Academy, and they found it really useful. And so it was a really effective bottoms-up way, because really professional learning works when people want to learn. And so when teachers come to you saying, this is something that I want spread to my peers because I think it will benefit all students, we found that to be very, very helpful. So when I think about it, it's almost crowdsourcing your professional learning. What is given what you see every day in the classroom, what is the best use of your time in order to learn, and what tools have you been using, and how can we support you and others in having greater access to that?
Hey, good morning. Thanks again to the panel. A very quick and specific question. One theory I've heard about a source of equality gaps in EdTech is that EdTech is typically introduced in the school system late in the career of the child, maybe late elementary school or middle school. And equality gaps creep in because some communities give children access to the kind of EdTech that creates a kind of creativity in the child much younger, but it's outside the school system. My question is specific. First of all, to what degree is this a reasonable cause for equality gaps? And would it or would it not be a reasonable solution to provide more EdTech at early ages?
So I'll just start by answering on the access part and the usage part. I think if you look at the report that NewSchools did in partnership with Gallup, usage across the board from K-12 is pretty consistent. So there's a lot of usage in early childhood and elementary, as well as middle and high school. So just in terms of like what students and teachers are using in terms of EdTech, they are using it in those grade levels. Now, how they're using it, I think that's part of what we're trying to really uncover and think about. And I would want to reserve judgment at this point because, if you're a teacher and you're really focused on an intervention because you're trying to help, a student gain literacy needs and you found a tool, it's not to say that, making that decision is the wrong thing versus, focusing on the use of EdTech in, a more creative or other way. And so we're just trying to evaluate what is the appropriate balance and like how should we do this? And so I think that's some of the work at NewSchools that we want to really dig into, and we want to talk to more educators and just get more data before we can like say, okay, here's how we might think about it, or here's so. Did you want to weigh in as well?
I would just second the point. I mean, for us, it's why I mentioned we started our 1-to-1 at grade 3, and we have a 2-to-1 ratio K-to-2. And actually, because we now have had that for 3 or 4 years, I'm now getting a lot of questions from my pre-K teachers, like when do we get laptops for our students? And I totally agree that like there is a potential for equity. I just wanted to give a specific example of why an area where we've started young because of the reason that you're talking about in terms of exposing equity gaps. So we also have in Springfield a CS for All program or initiative where we are working to put computer science lessons into every K-5 classroom. And that was pretty deliberate, because we figured, we can add AP CS and we can do lots of electives at the high school level. But by the time kids get to high school, they've already absorbed messages from the culture about whether they're good at computer science, whether they're good at science, whether they're good at math. So we felt like we had to start our computer science work in that K-5 for kind of exactly the reason you're talking about.
So yeah, in summary, access we know isn't enough. Like, let's be clear. We have 1 minute left, so I just want to give each person an opportunity just to give one takeaway that you want the audience to remember I think the one that just really resonates for me is rapid cycle evaluation. If you're using EdTech in schools, like finding ways to like quickly understand whether or not something is working is very important. And there are organizations and folks that are trying to help make that easier. So do that.
My one takeaway would be that media matters. There was a study done with 13,000 primary school kids were surveyed and about what they wanted to be in the future. 36% of them chose a profession based on people they know. 45% of the people who did not make that decision for that reason chose it because of the media. And so the media matters.
I think my takeaway would be, for those EdTech developers in the room, how can you help us think about how to use EdTech to support teachers to transform how they teach and how we do school?
And I would build on my previous panelists. The number one, what's most important in EdTech for me is coherence. And to what extent does the offering that we are looking at work in concert with the other elements of a student's day, both in and out of school, that results in them having access to an excellent education. So number one is coherence.
Thank you all for joining us. We hope we sparked some ideas and thoughts, and we hope you continue the conversation. Thank you.